Iran elects a new president. With record voter apathy and candidate selection mired in controversy, does the president-elect have a legitimate mandate to lead? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is Ebrahim Raisi. Well, Iran's election commission says he won by a landslide, but with the lowest voter turnout in the Islamic Republic's history. Some say Ebrahim Raisi's win is not worthy of celebration. Millions of Iranians boycotted the election, and many that did participate deliberately ruined their ballot papers, making invalidated votes first runner-up to the president-elect. Nevertheless, with 18 million ballots in his favor, Ebrahim Raisi will replace Hassan Rouhani as Iran's next president. In a moment, we'll discuss where the conservative cleric might take the country, but first, here's Natalie Pahonen.
The old guard and the new.
من خدمت برادر بسیار عزیزم حجت الاسلام و المسلمین جناب آقای رئیسی تبریک میگم مسئولیت سنگینی بر دوش ایشون قرار گرفت.
Hardliner and Judiciary Chief Ebrahim Raisi is Iran's president-elect. He's also a loyal ally to the supreme leader, Ayatollah-Khamenei, and he'll take up office in August.
One of the things we will pursue in our government is for all people to play a role, especially the elites and experts.
Even before polling day, many Iranians had expressed concern that the race was a foregone conclusion. Several moderate and reformist candidates were barred from running, clearing a path to the presidency for Raisi. That, in part, prompted calls for a boycott. More than half of voters stayed away from the ballot. It's the lowest ever turnout for a presidential election. But the expectations from those who did vote for Raisi are high.
We feel happy and cheerful that after 8 years of suffering from the previous government, by choosing him, we can have economic prosperity for Iran and its people.
The economy has been crushed by crippling sanctions imposed by the US after it withdrew from the 2015 nuclear deal. The dire financial situation for Iranians was made even worse by the fallout of the coronavirus pandemic. Raisi is known for being an open critic of the West, but during the campaign, he supported Tehran's talks with the 6 world powers to restore the deal. Those multi-nation negotiations have been taking place in Vienna and are due to resume next month.
We are closer than we were 1 week ago, but we are not still there. We have made progress on a number of technical issues. We have now more clarity on technical documents, some of them quite complex, and that clarity allows us to have also a clear idea of what the political problems are.
The president-elect is himself under US sanctions for alleged human rights violations, including links to the mass execution of political prisoners in 1988. The Biden administration says the ultimate decision on recommitting to the deal lies with the supreme leader.
Our people have shown that they resist various pressures, and they must know that the foreign policy of our administration does not start with the JCPOA and will not be limited to it either. We will view interaction with the world as an expansive and balanced interaction in foreign policy.
There is a chance that the accord could be revived before Raisi takes office. He's promised to change the economic circumstances of Iranians. But that will be almost impossible to achieve without a restoration of the deal. So the fate of the talks could also determine the trajectory of his presidency. Natalie Pahonen, the Newsmakers.
Let's talk further then about Iran's new president-elect and what's set to change for the country. And joining me from Isfahan, Iran, is political analyst and researcher in North American studies, Setareh Sadeqi. From New York, Amir Handjani, a fellow with the Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. And from Berlin is Fathollah-Nejad, a non-resident senior research fellow at the Afro-Middle East Center. Thanks all so much for being with us. I'll start with you, Ali, and let's first look at the president-elect's first address to the nation in his new role. I think if anyone was waiting to hear detailed plans on how he plans to take the nation forward, they were probably disappointed. I mean, did he surprise you in any way with what he said?
No, not at all. I mean, first of all, he said a few things that are consensus in the Islamic Republic. For instance, his plan to cooperate with China on a 25-year agreement that the Iranians signed with Beijing earlier this year. He also said that he would not meet President Biden in person, even if the JCPOA was resurrected, which is also not surprising. I mean, after all, Ebrahim Raisi is still on the US and EU sanctions list. And further than that, we didn't learn much concrete details from him when it comes to his agenda. This was also true during his campaign, which was largely based on economic populist slogans. So in terms of real policies and real substance, we didn't hear much.
Right. Setareh, you are in Iran. I would like to know first what you were hoping to hear. Did you get what you wanted? And specifically, if you can, address the fact that the Iranian economy is in the doldrums and very little was said about what he might do to help Iranians with the economic trauma that they're facing.
Well, yeah, I was neither surprised nor maybe quite disappointed because, as Ali also correctly mentioned, what he said is what the Islamic Republic has plans to do, and it's the general policy of the establishment. Nothing very different from in terms of foreign policy. Nothing very different from what we have previously seen from the other presidents. The only thing that he talked about, without mentioning details, of course, is that he will have more bilateral relations with the neighboring countries and the countries in the region, including Saudi Arabia. But regarding reviving the economy, his agenda is not very clear. And even when asked about his cabinet members, he didn't mention any names. And he said that later on, he and his colleagues are going to ask for people and experts to comment and to like have a say on who he's going to select, but he didn't actually talk about the details of his economic agenda or who he's going to have in his cabinet.
Okay. Amir, I mean, in the face especially of record voter apathy, I think many in the electorate would have hoped that he would have at least tried to bring some sense of, I don't know, enthusiasm for his new leadership, or at least rally the Iranian Republic with some words of encouragement to say, now I'm here, I'm going to motivate Iran, I'm going to bring the kind of change that we know we desperately need. He didn't really deliver on that front at all, did he?
No, he's not a very charismatic man. He's been a bureaucrat, at a high-level bureaucrat, his whole life. He ran the Ostan Razavi Foundation, which is the largest foundation in Iran. And he's been a regime insider for his entire career. He's not the symbol of change. He's a symbol of continuity for the Islamic Republic. I think the Supreme Leader and the Revolutionary Guards wanted someone who was compliant and who wouldn't make waves. The last two presidents made waves both in their own right. Ahmadinejad with his populism, and in his second term his anti-clericalism. And President Rouhani with his outreach to the West and the JCPOA, which were groundbreaking at the time.
Okay.
I think Raisi is not that.
And I mean, so if there really is any scope for change, Amir, I'll stick with you for a second. If there really is any scope for change, I think it's actually coming from the current regime, who still has a number of weeks left in office. Just the other day, we heard Javad Zarif actually say that the talks in Vienna are going very well, and he does expect the JCPOA to come back into force before this current regime actually does leave office and before Ebrahim Raisi takes over. Do you think that can actually happen? Do you expect to see the JCPOA back in play?
I do in some form. It doesn't really matter if it happens under President Rouhani or at the beginning of President-elect Raisi's term. It's going to come back in some form because the regime elites, the supreme leader, wants that to happen. And those decisions are made above the president's head. They go from the top down, not from the bottom up. So that will give, and I think that will be somewhat of a win for the new President Raisi, because there'll be some economic benefit, although how much economic benefit is up for debate, because many of the potential investors, the European partners, got burned the first time when the JCPOA happened and Trump came into power. And they're going to be much skittish the second time because they don't trust the American electorate to not elect another President Trump in 2024, or someone with his policies who will just pull out of the deal and then force everyone else to be reticent about investing and engaging.
Fair enough. And Ali, let me ask you then, there could be, correct me if I'm wrong here, there could be some additional strategy actually toward allowing the President Rouhani's regime to actually put the JCPOA back into effect, because if the current regime returns to the JCPOA, it will, in a sense, make it easier for Raisi and the non-reformers to blame anything that goes wrong in association with the agreement on the previous reformist regime.
Well, I mean, absolutely. And so it is most probable that the economic benefits going to be reaped by a future Raisi administration. But as Amir from New York rightly said, we don't know how much benefits it's gonna give Iran. And of course, there are also a few hurdles when it comes to the resurrection of the JCPOA. Not only the Iranian demand, which is very difficult to fulfill, which is to ask Washington that any sanctions relief should be permanent and could not be revoked by any future US administration. But also, on a larger scale, the question is what the Biden strategy on Iran is. Is it merely to go back to the Obama-era JCPOA and perhaps extend some of the sunset clauses? Or is it also to try to forge a more comprehensive deal with Iran that includes non-nuclear issues, specifically Iran's regional policies that have been quite expansive, but also its missile program? But if the United States decides to first revitalize the JCPOA by removing all relevant sanctions, there will be no leverage left for continuing talks with Tehran. And as Raisi said today in his press conference, Iran's position is still that it is not willing to negotiate on missile program and on regional policies.
Right.
But if we just go back to the Obama-era JCPOA, I don't think that this is going to be serving a sustainable peace in the region. It is probably going to trigger some kind of reaction from the anti-Iran front. So it's a very, it's a very complex puzzle.
Right. Setareh, let me just ask you then about, we talked about him not addressing the economy and the severe issues that are facing Iranians today. So do you think going forward that is all Ebrahim Raisi might have to bring economic benefit to Iran, is to hope that the work of the regime right now will at least break some of the sanctions and the economy can start to recuperate in that way on Raisi's watch?
Well, I think, that more than 17 million people in Iran voted for him. And a lot of people here see him as a very successful head of judiciary because they think and they feel that he had fought corruption inside that branch of power. So a lot of people are hopeful that he can do something about the economy, although I personally haven't seen any tangible, concrete plans of what he's going to do. But his rhetoric and his way of addressing the economic issues during his campaigns and during the televised presidential debates suggests that he has more of a what I would call more of a lefties economy, and he's going to rely on more domestic sources rather than whether or not the JCPOA is going to be fruitful, because he knows very well that the Iranian population is very disappointed with what the JCPOA, failed to achieve, which was the lifting of the sanctions. So what he says is that he's not going to wait for sanctions to be lifted before he's going to take action to revive the economy. Now, whether or not he's going to be successful and how he's going to carry out those campaign promises is still unknown, and we still have a long way ahead to see how he's going to address those issues. But I should also mention that he did mention in his speech today that he won or he had support from not only the principalists, but also other fractions and other political inclinations, including some of the reformists. So he believes that, and the parliament currently is also a majority principalist parliament. So he thinks that he has the support from the other governmental bodies inside Iran, and he probably has an easier job to revive the economy. But what is a major obstacle in satisfying the public opinion, the Iranian public opinion, is the historic low turnout that we had. And a lot of things about the establishment depends on how he's going to perform in his especially first 4 years.
Yeah. Amir, I'll put that to you. I mean, is this win worth it, or was there really too much manipulation leading to, too much apathy for this victory to really count that he might not be able to compensate for?
Well, I think Iran's issues aren't going to be solved by this election, and because his stance, his programs are not one of reform. They're not one of wholesale changes, which is what the Iranian economy needs. It's an ossified, state-run economy. It's been contracting now for 3 years. Some of that is because of sanctions. A lot of that is because it's not well run and it's not managed properly. It's rampant with corruption. You have state-run enterprises that aren't taxed, and there's a shadow economy that sometimes trumps the real economy. And it's difficult to see Raisi being able to corral that or change that. He's sort of just trying to keep the ship afloat and not make waves. And I think the Iranian electorate sees that, and that's why they stayed home. Yes, he got some votes, but he got some votes because there was only 7 candidates out of 600 that the Guardian Council said could run. And most of those candidates were hardline candidates. So it wasn't a free and fair election by Western standards. It was an election, and it has some merit, but the people that didn't go or cast protest votes say as much about the election as the ones who voted for Raisi.
Right. Ali, I mean, if he is going to be limited in a sense then to his domestic policy to help improve the lives of Iranians and perhaps mending regional relationships, where do you think Iran will be looking to build Iran as a state? If it can't rely on the West and any lessening sanctions, and it has to look closer inward, regional, where do you expect it to go?
Well, first of all, let me say something about the election results. I think the real victor of this time's election has been the boycotting campaign of Iranians vis-a-vis the election. We have seen the lowest voter turnout since the revolution, so more than half of Iranians decided not to vote, which is a vote of rejection vis-a-vis the entire establishment of the Islamic Republic, be they hardline or moderate. After all, also the moderate administrations have failed in providing the Iranians with their promises, with social and political improvements. And now we are basically seeing how the facade is falling of the Islamic Republic, where usually you have been talking about, or we have been talking about 2 pillars, one theocratic, the other Republican. But the Republican pillar is not a real Republican pillar, as we've seen from this election, which is which has been showing that it's the theocratic pillar that is omnipotent, and the Republican one is quite impotent. And so this is quite important to understand, and also the huge number of void votes, of spoiled votes, over 3 million. So if you count all of that, you see that this time around, there was a kind of civil disobedience campaign, if you want, that was going to send a strong signal to the entire establishment that Iranians are no more willing to cast their votes in order to increase, in order to help the Islamic Republic to portray itself as a legitimate system. So this is going to be also a challenge down the road in terms of state-society relations. When it comes to your question, I think, I mean, the presidency is not that important, as Amir has pointed out at the beginning. It's the supreme leader of Iran, it's the RGC who called the shots, and this will going to be the case. When it comes to Raisi's pledge to mend relations with neighboring countries, this is also what we have been hearing from past administrations. It is difficult to foresee that this is going to be easy for Iran to mend its relations with Saudi Arabia. After all, there are still geopolitical ambitions from both sides that cannot be reconciled easily. On a larger level, Tehran needs to get rid of US sanctions, even if it wants to reap the full benefits from relations with Eastern great powers, with China, for instance, who has also halted quite massively its interactions with Iran in the past few years because of the US extraterritorial sanctions. So all those challenges are not new. And it's not Raisi who is going to make a difference here. It's going to be the old centers of power.
Yeah, but the key word you used is make a difference. It's hard to see how there can be any real changes made. I mean, you brought up the act of civil disobedience that you see in the voter apathy, but we've seen civil disobedience in Iran before in a much greater form, including massive protests that were quashed. And with all that, we're right back to seeing a conservative cleric in power again today. But another issue with Ebrahim Raisi, Setareh, I'll let you talk about this. You alluded to it before. He's also facing specific targeted sanctions against him. So not only does he not have the support of the Iranian public, he is particularly seen as a threat that's been sanctioned by the U.S. government, and in return, with those sanctions, there will be other parties that can't deal with the president because of those U.S. sanctions. I mean, how does he go about actually trying to institute any kind of change? We know the president also only answers to one power, but still, he is the leader of the country, and he is, in a sense, sanctioned both domestically and internationally.
Well, a lot of people from the other parties have already declared that although they didn't agree with President-elect Raisi and his election, but now that he is elected by the majority of the people who did vote, which is we had a election turnout of more than 48%, which is historic low, but still about 30 million people voted, and more than 60% of those voted for Mr. Raisi. So I think it's very important to remember that the Iranian political system and the dynamics of Iranian political system is not, it's very complicated. You cannot simply say that there are, like, for example, hardliners and moderates, and they are it's the supreme leader who is making decisions. You can see a lot of differences in, for example, the foreign policy decisions that are made by the governments during principalists or moderates or reformists.
Okay.
And I think U.S. sanctions on Raisi or on any other Iranian officials are more symbolic than actual, because a lot of those people do not have, most of them do not have any, it doesn't really affect them in a lot of ways.
Right.
It's different for the president, of course, but still, inside Iran, a lot of people are so concerned about the economy and the financial struggle that is going on in the country that they do not really care about how the president is sanctioned or how he's perceived by the West or by the US. And one reason is that they saw President Rouhani and Foreign Minister Zarif, who tried very hard and who had very strong diplomatic skills, but still he and the Iranian nation were betrayed by the United States and the European signatories of the deal.
Okay.
And the Iranian public has lost any hopes that any deal with the West would solve their economic struggle or problems.
Amir, I have to apologize. I was hoping to give you a quick final word, but we are completely out of time for this edition of the Newsmakers. So I'd like to thank all three of my panelists really so much for being with us. It's greatly appreciated. Our viewers, of course, for being with us as well. We'll see you next time.